Hello, my name is Camila, and I'm a student of currently at Universidad Tecmilenio in high school, and I'm going to talk about the Cold War. In a summary, the Cold War was a political rivalry that took place or began in March 12 in 1947. It was a conflict between the USA and the Soviet Union, including the respective allies, and it developed after World War II, and it ended in 1991. Now, the Cold War term means basically when two countries have a conflict with a political hostility and military, just like I said before with USA and the Soviet Union. They have a tension where things like threats, economic sanctions, power blocks, propaganda, subversion, and among many others are involved. Now, there are two important economic systems that were involved during this Cold War. Basically, was the capitalism and the socialism. Capitalism is just a private property that allows people to have tangible assets such as land and homes, as well as other types of stocks or bonds. And people look basically for their own good without taking in consideration socio-political pressure. And the person who started this was Adam Smith, being identified as the father of modern capitalism. One example that we of course all know in today's is the USA, and well, he was involved in the Cold War, and he's a great example of what capitalism is or refers to. Now, socialism is the contrary, is the whole opposite, because it is based in equality and personal initiative, economic equality, okay? So, moral cooperation of an individual is also looked in here. It just creates a solidary world and a different way of working with the economy, pursuing a social transformation and a different world, and just the opposite from capitalism. Marx and Engels were the people who started with the socialism as a scientific vision, and then it took place in the economy. Some examples of socialism are China, North Korea, and Cuba. And we know that Cuba and North Korea doesn't have a really well-structured political and economy, because they are trying to pursue equality in a way that is just not healthy for everyone. And China, it's a good country, but to be honest, there's some things which I don't completely agree with, because it doesn't search for a fair equality, just in my opinion. What countries were the world leaders during this period?
United States was the leader of the Western Bloc, while the Soviet Union was the Eastern Bloc leader.
Why did the countries who were allies during the wars became enemies afterwards?
They were allies in the World War II because they had a common goal of fighting the Germans. But right after, they realized, right after the ending of the World War II, they realized their political and ideology was completely opposed, capitalism against communism.
Where did the Cold War take place?
Well, mainly in America, Europe, Asia, and part of Africa as well.
What opinion did the general public have of the Cold War?
I would say that in America there was a lot of propaganda against communism. So there were people that truly fear spreading of the communism around the world, while others opposed totally against actions that the United States was taking against, for example, the Korean War or the Vietnam War.
And lastly, what type of weapons did the two world powers have at their disposal?
Well, I mean, there was always since the very start of in between 1947 through 1991, there was a military race and space race. But talking about military weapons at disposal was, um, air or the warplanes, warships. Uh, but the most fear was certainly nuclear missiles that were pointed at the Russian ones were pointed to the United States and Europe, while the ones from United States was pointing out to Russia. I think the highest point of tension was 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, where really people and the public fear about a imminent World War III.
For me, the Cold War was something very interesting because I think the phrase from enemies to lovers, it's maybe using here backwards from lovers to enemies because U.S. and the Soviet Union were friends because they were against Hitler and their operation system. But as long as Hitler was dead and everything of that conflict ended, they didn't have any specific goal. So they started the conflict because they saw how different they were and they weren't compatible at all because once they were communists and the others were capitalists. So a lot of things happened to maybe prove their value and their brave. I don't know why, because the U.S. was constantly sending stuff to help, and the Soviets didn't like that because they saw it as a bribe, since they didn't have the resource or the enough resources to help the other affected nations by Hitler. It was a constant conflict of them. Of course, the Soviet Union was trying new weapons and new nuclear bombs just in case they were supposed to be needed, and the US also was kind of doing the same thing. Then the Soviets they launched to space the Sputnik thing to orbit around the Earth, and the US said, you know what, I'm gonna do the same thing, but I want to also create NASA. And they were just having this constant fight, and they were just trying to merge or to give fear to the citizens of both sides, to innocent people. And thank to God, it ended pretty well in peace by both parties, of course, with the US terms. But to be honest, it was like a really silly war to me because if they just both stayed in their sides and with their principles and values, this wouldn't have been necessary to happen. So I think if they just got into an agreement beforehand, I don't know, maybe of course US tempted the Soviet Union because they were like helping the other nations, and the other nations said, you know what, capitalist by US, oh, we like that. And of course Soviets didn't like that at all, but if they just got into an agreement before, they could have just avoided this and affecting innocent people jobs and fear and everything. But yeah, that's my personal opinion of the Cold War. I just wanted to add something else, that the war maybe haven't been completely ended. Maybe directly yes, but indirectly it's like still there because it is shown on TV shows and American ones like on Netflix, that the constant fight of communists and capitalists, of course showing the US capitalist people are the good ones and the bad boys are the communists. Like a good example is Stranger Things. Stranger Things is a popular Netflix show where they showed this in the 1980s, and of course both countries, they don't export things, so yeah, it is still in there, like a little bit, like just a little spine or something of this conflict, but of course not with nuclear bombs and everything that was just set back in the last century.